As we mentioned, this is going to be our last discussion panel of the
Quisiera empezar
entire
haciendo un poco la
gathering. I'd like to start
recapitulación
off just by
del recorrido de
summarizing a
este
little bit
evento.
of the trajectory of
Tal y como
this
se planteó
event, just as we
en los
mentioned
objetivos, pues
in the
empezaba
original
con una
goals. We
comprensión
started off with
compartida
just a shared
del contexto,
understanding
del
of the
momento
context,
político que
of the
atravesamos y la
political moment that we're
importancia
currently traversing and the
de hacer una
importance
especie de
of being
catarsis y
able
de
to
recoger
make
los
a
elementos desde las
recollection of all the
diferentes
elements
países
of
para
all the different
un
nations
momento
represented
de,
here for a moment of.
gracias,
Thank you. Thank
un
you.
momento de
For a
catarsis
moment
incluso,
of.
¿verdad? De ese momento inicial, pues pasábamos a
And from
conocer
this moment,
experiencias,
we went
sistemas,
on to get
historia,
to know
metodología,
systems,
procesos
methodologies,
inspiradores, que
processes,
fue un poco
inspiring
el día de ayer para empezar a pensar
trajectories
un poco las
to be able to
estrategias, y no
start
solo
thinking
pensar
yesterday on
nuevas
strategies, not
estrategias, en
only to
efecto, como
meditate on these
decía, no hay
strategies, but just
tanto
as
que
they mentioned,
repensar,
there's not
sobre
so much
todo
to
tenemos
rethink, but above all,
que
we just need
resituar,
to
que respetar,
reset,
que reconocer,
respect,
que
acknowledge,
reconocernos en las vivencias
re-acknowledge us, in our
compartidas.
shared
Y
experiences
este
and our
tercer
shared
día lo
moments.
que
And on this
busca
third day,
es
what we're striving for is
pues aterrizar
to
un
be
poco
able to
con el cierre de este evento,
land
pero
the closing
tomar
of this event
fuerzas,
and also
energías,
to be
inspiración para lo que
re-energized,
viene, para que lo que toque nuestros espacios,
re-energized,
territorios y
revamped,
demás,
with
y para lo
everything
que en
having to do with
conjunto
our
podamos
spaces, territories, and
sostener
everything, and that jointly
y
we can
construir
maintain
desde
and
este
build
esfuerzo.
together based
Entonces,
on
como
this effort. So
cierre,
then, as
antes
a
del
closing,
cierre, queremos
prior, the
presentar este
pre-closing, we'd like to present
conversatorio,
this exchange,
este
this
último
discussion
momento de
panel, this last
compartir
moment of
experiencias,
sharing
propuestas,
experiences, proposals,
perspectivas,
perspectives,
luces, le he llamado
insight,
un poco
and I've
para el
shared a little bit
futuro
more
desde
lights
la
for the
diversidad
future
de quienes
from
estamos
the
aquí
diversity of
también.
those gathered here together. Now,
Cerramos entonces
and so then we're going
la
to get
ronda de
ready to close
conversatorios
this
con dos
round
aportes
of
desde la
panels
experiencia de
based on the
quienes me
experience of
acompañan
those that are
en
with
este
me here
panel
on this
para hablar y
stage, in this panel,
compartir
to be able to
sobre
share
diálogos.
and
Ya voy
talk
a
on
especificar un
dialogues. Now
poco
I'm
más.
about to
Diálogos que han
be more
sido
specific. We're going to
mencionados dentro de
dialogues
las
and changes that have been
alternativas y
shared
las
among the
necesidades que hemos
alternatives and
estado
needs that
hablando a
we've
lo
been
largo de
talking
estos
about
3
throughout
días,
these
2 y medio,
3 days,
y la
2.5 days,
importancia de
and the
mecanismos
importance of
trans e intergeneracionales donde
trans and
aprendamos
intergenerational
mutuamente en
mechanism
esa
where we can
lógica de
learn mutually
inteligencia
within this
colectiva que
logic of
planteaba
collective
hace un
intelligence
rato la
that
compañera
my
de
colleague
Colombia.
from Colombia
Esto es un
just
poco también
presented
de
a
lo
little
que
bit
se va a
more. This is a little bit
compartir.
more
Me
about what we're
pareció
about to share. I
muy
believe that it's
atinado
also
poder
very
enganchar ahí con lo que
timely
ya
to be
se
able to connect and
retroalimentaba
hook with every
esta
all the
mañana
feedback that we were
de lo trabajado el día
talking
de
about
ayer.
this morning, based on everything
Ayer
that was
Ángela Cook
discussed
en el
yesterday.
panel de
Yesterday,
medios de
Angela Cook in
comunicación
the
dijo
mass
nada sin las
media
mujeres
such said
indígenas,
nothing
pero
without
toca
indigenous
decir
women, but
también
we've also got to
nada
say
sin las
nothing without
juventudes,
young people,
nada sin las
nothing
mujeres,
without
nada sin los
women,
pueblos
nothing
indígenas,
without indigenous
nada sin
people,
la diversidad
nothing
de quienes
without the
somos,
diversity of
de quienes
those who
integran
we
e
are, of
integramos
those who
nuestros
comprise
colectivos, nuestras
all of our
luchas,
collectives, all
nuestros
of our struggles, and
territorios.
all of our
Y bueno,
territories.
dicho esto como
So, having said this
introducción,
as
les
a brief
invito
introduction,
a
I would
escuchar
like to
en
invite
primera
you to
instancia a
be able to
Myriam
hear
Mendez
first of all
Montalvo,
Myriam Mendez
que nos va a
Montalvo,
hablar sobre el
who's
diálogo
going to be
entre opuestos y
speaking on
diversos
the
para profundizar
diverse
la democracia.
dialogues to be able to
Myriam es
proliferate democracy.
abogada de origen
Myriam is an
colombiano,
attorney
fue
originally from
asesora del alto
Colombia. She was an
comisionado para
advisor to
la
the
paz
High
durante las
Commissioner for Peace
negociaciones del
during the
acuerdo con las FARC
negotiations
y dirigió
of
la
the treaty
transición de
agreement with
la
the FARC
vicepresidencia
and
de Francia Márquez en
oversaw the
2022.
transition
A
of
nivel
Francia
internacional,
Marquez in
ha
2022.
trabajado
At an
con
international
el
level, she
Tribunal
has
Penal
worked with
Internacional
the
para la ex Yugoslavia
International
en La Haya,
Criminal
Países Bajos, el
Court
PETIC
of
de Nueva York,
Yugoslavia in
Idea
New York,
Internacional en
and then the
Suecia y la
International
Fundación
Day
Foro,
in Sweden,
liderando
and the
iniciativas en
Ford Foundation, working on inclusion and environmental sustainability. She leads the international platform of dialogue, bold to engage, that gathers former military warfares, guerrillas, leaders, business leaders, and academics as well. Thank you, Myriam, for being able to share with us today, okay? Thank you, Ana Paula. Yesterday I heard that I was one of those individuals that when she got the form and said if she would be interested in being able to share her experience, I wrote yes. And behold, here am I. So then I'd like to start off by expressing a very special thank you to Global Exchange, to FOCO, and to all of the teams that have made this incredible gathering possible. That's just 3 days in Guatemala, but surely it has a lot of preparatory work and a gargantuan task. After following our departure, thank you to Derry Huter, to Global Exchange, who has also been an ally of those bold enough to dialogue and exchange in Colombia. Thank you so much for making this possible. In addition, I'd like to thank Guatemala, a country in which I've had the opportunity of living at one time or another and seeing the development of my professional career in the search of my life purposes, and greet the indigenous authorities. Thank you so much for receiving us. Thank you for your resilience. And obviously, I want to thank all of our participants. Obviously, this warrants an acknowledgement of everything expressed here. And I truly recognize and honor your struggles, your dreams, and your roadways of hope. And having heard all of this, I'm going to briefly share a little bit on how bold it is to dialogue and exchange. And it's great to see that it's within this panel's context of this exchange, wherein we're going to be talking about the possibilities for the near future of hope and of the lights before us. And it's bold to dialogue and exchange, and this process, we have diverse, and what I'm about to share, I believe, is a process that provides us with learnings not only as a tool in and of itself to converse or for timely release, but also as a pedagogical and democratic practice that aids us in the building of public assets, that are essential for the exercise and execution of democracy. So I'm about to share is a little bit about the experience from Valientes. I'm going to share our learnings of a citizen dialogue process between those in favor and those against in Colombia. And as an experience, I'd also like to share that Valiente, it is bold to dialogue. It's free of formulas. It's free of recipes, but it does have living learnings on how people, including those with diverse differences, can recognize and acknowledge one another. And previous to going, and I'd like to just quickly explain how I would like to carry out this intervention, bringing it down to 3 segments. An initial segment of considerations, a second segment concerning the experience of it's bold to dialogue and exchange, and third with final reflections and feedback. So then, considering this initial point, the first question that we ask ourselves in this process is concerning the conflict. And obviously, they've stated it here, it's been conversed throughout all these days, that conflict is inherent to life. Wherever there's life, wherever there's society, and there's differences, there's frictions, there's differences. And conflict is always going to be stimulating for change. The challenge that we face in Colombia, for example, is that the way of solving this conflict, the way of being able to process and navigate it, has been through violence. And unfortunately, we're a nation that's gone through 7 decades of violence. We haven't been able to leave it behind it, not only affecting our coexistence, our social fabric, but it ends with life itself. And we're increasingly seeing, just as it's been stated here in several of our interventions, how diversity and the differences, which is a richness in current time, each time is becoming grave threats in our society. So then we're currently living in a world, or in several worlds, where contexts have been marked through extremely hazardous and dangerous dynamics, where those who think differently, the opposition, the other, ends up being the enemy. And this leads us to binary systems. It's either them or us. And these binary systems as have us in a logic where each one strives to impose their own vision, and accompanied also, especially as was stated the first day, of all the emotions that these processes carry with it. And we are also inspiring times where the dominant emotions are rage, fear, revenge, and distrust. And this is not only left within our social environment, but it crosses into family borders, friendships, and our own relationships. And once we're extremely polarized, which is a way of understanding polarization as a concept, just as I'm explaining over here, we no longer even see the other individual. I don't need David to say anything to know what David's about to say, right? Just seeing him and seeing how he dresses, the color of his skin, I already make an assumption and I put on a mask and assign a label to them. And so then we think according to what we see and according to what we judge, and we assign interpretation to it. So the polarization is no longer the confrontation amongst ideas between different people, but just Casastino, an academic, North American academic and attorney, said it's an isolation of groups who only hearken to their own voices. And they do so, in addition, radicalizing their positions, and the causes can be several. You know, there's something we also discussed over here: limited information, the need that we have of social approval, the dire need that we also have of for the search, for them to confirm our own ideas. We feel wonderful when someone comes in and says, I totally agree with you, you're absolutely right, whatever you say, and that helps us feel quite well. But the challenge issue with all this is that societies actually start losing vital values for coexistence. One is trust. John Polak, who you all might be aware of, a great academic from the US, for me, if you would allow me expression, a great apostle of the transformation of conflict. It says that the first victim of conflict is trust, yes, and the ability also of hearing and understanding, biased visions, and the ability to create, to create joint solutions, which in a word that paradoxically requires it. Like I said, we said before, there's not one same solution that can help all of us. It's not just instant solutions for the problems that we face. Colombia obviously has not been foreign, as I've said it before, in a survey that Statistic Department carries out, that 60% of Colombians distrust one and another. 60%, over 60% distrust one another. And of course, no society that slays itself can advance. And we understand violence, like this Egalito describes in his 3 dimension, would be speaking a little bit louder because the competition in the music here is pretty loud and strong. I'm fighting over that music. The triangle of violence, where we not only have the physical, the one that slays, that takes our lives, but also symbolic violence, prejudices, stigmatizations, biases. This is the triangle of violence that takes another person without giving them a different, and structural violence, which is well known in Latin America, that denies rights, that makes others invisible, that has us condemned to inequality, poverty, and a lack of opportunity. And I go on to the second part of my intervention, which is concerning the bold. So the bold is to dialogue insert itself within these spaces of conflict and violence. And we propose something simple yet ambitious at the same time, which is to be able to stretch bridges, to open spaces between different people with different trajectories, with different ideologies and ways of understanding the world, with different pains. Colombia is obviously a nation that has much pain, over 9 million victims, to be able to sit down together and converse. But not only to converse, but also to foster trust and to acknowledge that we're all part of a common world. The task of valientes, of bold to dialogue, is that of building bridges between those who would never, ever dream of sitting together. Anna was saying that we need to do certain things with women, with indigenous people, with victims, but also with business people as well, but also with politicians, but also with the other, with those who are different. We can't afford to just isolate ourselves and just act within the logical frames that many of us have suffered, and add an equation where we repeat the same processes. And notice now that we have a new pope, before stepping up here, one of the announcements there in the media said that the first message that this new pope has sent is, I invite you to stretch bridges. I invite you to create bridges. That is the task of the bold, to dialogue. And we were born in the context of the pandemic, of wear out, the wear out of mechanisms of representative representation, and we have over 120 different mechanisms in Colombia of representation, and that we are a national platform that for citizens, independent, where we find leaders of every type of nature, business, political, indigenous, peasants, ex-combatants, on every side of the ex-paramilitary, of ex-guerrillas, of the armed forces of Colombia, communities such as LGBTQ, trans, cultural, academic, religious. And the purpose is to better understand complex problems and to build shared visions of nations. And we have 6 different strategic points. We have an agenda, return to the field, illicit economics, acknowledgement, inclusion, biodiversity, and active democracy. And how do we carry this out? Well, by dialoguing, not between the same, but between opposers and not at junctions, but shared experience says that junctions doesn't allow us to build common purposes. It's always long-term thinking on long-term strategies. And we've been able to achieve a great agreement, which is any consensus has got to be under the umbrella that's designed to weave consensus for worthy life and for everyone's well-being. Obviously, we have methodologies. We've developed this quite broadly. Galton, Ledera, Cahen, everything that Lauderin is doing in the Berkeley Institute, Simon Chambers over there, and freedom, democracy. We have quite a broad group of inspiration that have helped us develop certain ideas which I would like to share concerning the methodological principles. First of all, multi-partiality. Multi-partiality is essential. Why? For these exercises to work. Number 2, these are not spaces solely of ideas, but these are spaces that are partially in thought. We do not only bring with what we have in our thought, but with emotions, pains, burdens. It's very important in exchange of knowings. If we don't understand the knowings, kind of like science, technology, the knowings that each one brings, ancestral in nature, that of lived experiences, and also of scientific knowledge. This is a space to be able to take our masks off, because we all assign a mask for everything. I think you've already placed one on me. This is normal. So then, these are exercises to take those masks off. These are opportunities to connect and build. And there's a wonderful principle that we developed, and that is what of the square meter. Each one of us has a square meter of impact, of action. That square meter, each one square meter is different. There's no doubt that the square meter of the entire global exchange is much larger than the square meter of bold to dialogue, valentes de dialogar. But it's only by joining this that it increases. This is a place that expands square meters. But all too often, in the exercise of civil society, in the exercise of social movements, it says, well, we can't reach it. But the addition of all of these efforts can increase the square meters of possibilities for impact. And some lessons. We've created safe spaces. We can't do this unless we have a safe space for everyone where we can truly dissent with respect. We are respectful of dissent. We don't want just unity, but we want plurality. And we submit proposals. There are lots of stories. I could share the story of the former leader of the FARC sitting with the son of Jorge 40, one of the most bloody paramilitaries. We're doing an encounter. Timocheto had just had a son, and the son of Jorge Cualeta, the ex-military, tells me, I commit to work for a nation where your son won't have to experience everything that I've experienced, stigmatized by being the son of a paramilitary father. We've had students even, of social mobilizations, gathered with generals of the police forces, students that have lost their eyes. Yesterday, our Chilean peers were stating this, we have ex-generals of the Air Force, seated with ex-combatants of the FARC. One of them, Tanya Menneger, the famous Dutch woman, where one of these generals was telling her, to know that I went through life trying to bombard your territory to kill you. Now I'm seated over here in this place with you, building shared visions of a nation. So that we have lots of wonderful stories, to be honest with you. And before proceeding to my final conclusions, I'd like to share two important lessons. Prioritize the humane and relationship. We've got to be truly interested in human beings, and this doesn't happen, spontaneously. This needs the necessary attention, methodology, infrastructure. It needs strategies. There's something that we've learned is, for example, on how governments manage dialogue. It's like a tactic to solve a timely issue, to keep people from stepping out on the street, from marching there, to get them out of the highways, to remove those blockades, allowing mobility to continue in the nation. Dialogue can be designed for that, but dialogue needs to be a strategy. It's got to be a way of understanding our coexistence. And I think that I've run out of time. I apologize. And I also want to share a final reflection, yes? Now, I want to once again bring Jean-Paul Lera that speaks of moral imagination. And he says that it's that capacity to imagine something anchored in this world's challenges that it still does not exist, but we need to discover it together. And this resonates a lot to the conversation that we've engaged in. No, we already know what doesn't work, no, but we don't precisely know exact how to fix it. We have to understand that democracy hasn't worked. It hasn't worked well for everyone, but never neglecting our ideals, the ideal of the values of equality, liberty, etc. The second one is a dialogue, an exchange helps us to think that new thing, that for a dialogue to be at the core of it, a dialogue to be at the center of it, to help us. It's not about me with me or me with those who think like me, but a dialogue with those that think differently, that'll encourage me, that'll urge me to take the step and find those who think differently. That uncomfortable conversation I'm going to share with someone that I can't even see in a picture, but I would never, ever have them step foot into my house. Why? Because we've got to solve this. Listen, in Colombia, the correlation of forces is not enough, to find an exit one for another. David shared this right now. Not even the government of change. In other words, we need great consensus, and for this we need a dialogue, deliberation with Global Exchange. Thanks to their support, we've been able to do surveys concerning the desire to deliberate in Colombia, and the numbers are right there. And one of the most revealing numbers is that 58% of those who responded said, we've got to do this amongst everyone, even those who oppose each other. We can't just do this in one sector, not only academia, not only young people, not only universities, etc. It's got to be done by all. And I just want to close by quoting Salvaventura that says that democracy is the grammar to coexist with different people from us, with those different from us. And dialogues can lead us to be able to work with those different from us, the possibility to do those things that institutions, representation, participation have not been able to achieve. And it's that democracy might also turn a joint set of practices and behaviors. And one of the main learnings that we've employed is that it has to start with us. It's the consciousness, awareness of change that each and every one has got to embody. And I want to close with this point. Differences are a reason of violence and ruptures, generally speaking. And we are making of dialogue not an ingenious notion, but we believe that this is truly something, a transformative political act. And bold to dialogue, here we're learning that once a person decides to take time to hear and put a pause on a text, that they decide to acknowledge before excluding, they're broadening that common space all the much more. And even though it might seem quite little and minute, it's the beginning of all true transformation. So then to dialogue is to be bold, and more than ever now we need that boldness. Thank you so much for hearing.
Thank you, Myriam. Thank you to those that supported us. So we could pay attention because of the sound. And I'd like to take back one of the ideas that Myriam proposed, and she gave us useful time to think about the diversity and the opposites, because that's the hardest step. I would also take back the union of strength when we spoke about Guatemala's current scenario and what measures to take. A colleague said, let's analyze the coercion of strength in critical steps in many countries. A colleague from Colombia yesterday in one of the groups mentioned we have this government in Colombia. It's not what we were expecting. We want to build something different. We want something from a different nature. But what in the meantime, who do we speak to in the meantime? Who do we negotiate with? And that's the reality. We are currently living in Guatemala. It's not the government we wanted, but we defended it because it was the most visible option. And that's what happens when you have dialogues and points of gathering with those we never thought we would. But we're back to this area we're in now because we have a diversity of people, organizations, political organizations that don't really match as we can see, and it was a challenge. And elements that Myriam has shared give us an input as to what to do in our own immediate organization, and in the measure we expand to the approaches for countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Colombia, of course, that come from war and genocide processes. In the case of Guatemala, in the transitional processes that had certain advances and then a lot of pushbacks, are very complex to propose in this scenario. In my favor, I'll say, Myriam, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ana Paula Lopez Iglesias. I'm participating. I'm part of the FOCO team since last year, and I have given a companionship to farmers that are in the indigenous sector, and we have to sit down with the farmers and indigenous people, with the chamber of agro, which is the most opposite sector. We could sit with farmers and two other sectors of government. So it's very useful due to the personal framework I move in, which is like a master's degree for me. With this experience, I will present Bosque David Iglesias Guzmán, who will talk about the emergence of trans intergenerational mechanisms for the struggles of mechanisms in a fascist stage. Bosque is a biologist and has a master's degree in the University of Morelos. has been part of different multidisciplinary teams in interinstitutional context with universities, research centers, human aid centers, and as an activist and promoter of civil society projects currently. He's a consultant with the South Urban Institute, where he organized in Nuevo León, Mexico, the first activity, and has broadened the civic spaces to nurture emancipation, and is a member of For Mexico Today, a group that looks to share ideas and debates for the construction of a Mexico of equalities. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Ana Paula. Thank you, Grupo Foco. Thank you, Global Exchange, for doing the calling and having this space. And we are in an ancestral Mayan territory in Guatemala. I'd like to acknowledge that Grupo Foco from the methodology makes us a reminder of this with this altar that has been looking over our work, and with the beautiful ceremony we had with Grandma Lake. I feel a bit of anger and uncomfortable because of the noise outside and the party that's going on outside. And those that are outside have the right to the party wherever they come from. But we have the right to talk amongst ourselves, and we would have the right to do so without having anger. And so those who feel the same, let's yell and make similar noise to say we're here, and we want to use our energy to listen to each other and not to try to filter it and noise that's outside. Do you agree? Guzmán does not have a D. And should we have another phrase? What another phrase? What other phrase? 3. USAC no tiene rector. USAC doesn't have a dean. And then
¡Esos políticos a la libertad!
freedom to those that are in prison due to political reasons. In the form of description, there was a box that said, "Would you like to share?" And I filled it out, and spitting out the ideas I had at that time. And I feel this title, "The Importance of Mechanisms in Transgenerationals at Times of Fascist Seduction." In simple words, is how do we turn the tortilla in a storytelling battle. And this title, they told me I had to present, and I had to think, what's fascist seduction and what are its different times? So we are at times of fascist seduction. In the previous presentation, there were many clues of this, and those boards are filled with many ideas. When we talk about authoritarianism, we're talking about fascist ideas. And the times of fascist seduction are the times when we're youth groups, overall male youth groups that are starting to get interested in politics and public life in their context, are more attracted to hate speeches, authoritarian speeches, cruelty to others that are different from them, than speeches that talk about collectivity building and being caring for others and moving slowly forward. to interpret these times of fascist seductions, where I'll take something that Myriam shared. These times of fascist seduction, we have to look into our inner selves. How are we processing our own violences? And how our insufficiency to process our own insufficiencies to process our generational and intergenerational traumas take us to position ourselves on the side where we like extermination, cancellation, deactivation, and getting rid of what makes uncomfortable about others, how easy it's to blame and be cruel to the weakest that we consider that are weakest and those that are not equal to us. So beyond that personal reflection, I'd like to talk about the next one, a proposal from Anastasia Cesena from 10 years ago, from an article called The Complete Spectrum Strikes at Different Times, and thinking about the context and how there is a strategy to exterminate others from those that detect power, taking over simultaneity and impunity. So they don't give us an opportunity to not take some air, and the subjugation. They tell us they're going to invade Greenland and get rid of those that are make them feel uncomfortable. They will take intensity from us, take away the rights to health, education, and we don't know which one to respond to. There we have simultaneity looking for subjugation. We're isolating ourselves, making ourselves weaker, losing memory to the stories of pushback, and we don't know how to respond in a context of impunity where it would seem as if they could show and disappear without cost. And at these times of faces seduction, where they have subjugation, simultaneity, and impunity, they are making the communities aside, and we need to think about mechanisms to rise from this trauma, from this hit. And I was missing something. I believe that in this wonderful time that's so diverse, we must acknowledge we are part of the communities and of the people that are in pushback. We're doing an exercise that creates tension and makes us feel uncomfortable. We're learning a lot from you, and it's important to acknowledge you as our elder siblings before a white person came and told us how to organize ourselves in democracy. Communities were already organized and had their own ways. So we're not bringing key ideas. We are here to have a dialogue, and from this epistemic subvention to have a result come out. And from this theory of trauma, how do we work with the international dialogue? There are different types of trauma when it's unique, when it's complex and continuous. The people in pushback have been doing this for 600 years, surviving colonialism, patriarchy, and there are different types of trauma, individual and collective. We could focus on collective, that could be historical, cultural, and structural. I will share this presentation. May I move on to the next slide? How do we respond to trauma? Here's a response that's very instinctive: to fight back. We get mad, we fight, we rise. The other ones to run away. We leave behind everything we've built, everything that was there. We leave it behind, and I love that other one because it's from the south part of Mexico where I'm from. There are rabbits that are called like grasshoppers, like grass bunnies, and what they do is they freeze themselves in front of the threat, and that the predator thinks it's dead and they leave it alone. Next one. These are different types of response, and the changes could be behavioral, physical, spiritual. And I'd like to ask you to think about our activism, how it has changed in front of the trauma of complete spectrum of the fascism that's announced. And there are key consequences of trauma. From one side, we could isolate ourselves and become aggressive, and we could be hypersensible. We could have an internal disorganization. We can't focus. We're confused. We lose healthy memory. We forget we've lived other times of threats. We forget we've been part of societies that have arisen from coup of state, from dictatorship and fascism that has lasted decades. We are descendants of those pushbacks. And so what we have to do to losing healthy memory, open areas to take some air, talk to others, listen to others, recover our resilient memory, remember our pushbacks, acknowledge our elder siblings that have taught us how they've walked in communities and how they've helped us at moments of trauma. And the next one is a quick personal story. This is a long slide of Tikkun in an email with my dad. I'm a person that I'm very fortunate to have good communication with my dad. In 2011, I was telling him I was in a rush because I was leaving my job to go on a Pacific March in Ángel de la Independencia in the main square of Mexico City. And the night before, an armed command had launched some lights on in a casino in Monterrey, and that was what the demonstration was about. And what I told my dad was, I'm concerned that the media is publishing fascist speeches to face social decomposition, and that they have military authority to exercise fascist control. And my dad responded that in front of the authoritarian conflict, we should look for those that give us more freedom. And he gave me this from Tikkun as inspiration. Where are the words? Where do we hunt? Where are my ancestors? Where's my love? Where are my friends? There aren't any, my child. It's everything about to be built. You must find the language you're going to speak and find the ancestors that will make you free. You must build a house where you will no longer be alone, and the education to love again. And this will all be done by yourself, because those that have awakened, it's a nightmare that's still sleeping. And the true process where you abandon yourself, you are in the ruins of civilization, and that's why, because it's in ruins, you will not have the possibility to face this. It's a very curious war we're in, a war that requires the world to have languages and places that constitute homes in the middle of disaster to understand how, as survivors of ruins of a civilization that has fallen apart, and it could be the liberal democracy, it's in ruins, but we must open new homes where we can find ourselves with new communities and find ourselves with ancestral communities. And thinking that this is a very important mission that we must keep walking with, I bring three humble examples of what we've been doing with this emerging organization that's Lab Inside, to have intergenerational dialogue, to reconnect with memories of other pushback, and Lab Inside. We start talking in 2003 with several friends that have given companionship in processes of 2012, 2018. I hate to count time periods like the elections in Mexico, but sometimes that timeline of elections has made us act during the electoral times. During this time of 2012 and 2018, several colleagues have given companionship, and they have helped us to raise our head after the terror of Yoxinapa. And in front of the election from 2024, we said no one's debating, no one's having a dialogue. How do we continue with the agendas of truth, memory, and justice? How do we continue with the agendas of autonomy and emancipation? The national debate is between if they do it, it's correct, and the agendas are not being discussed. And then we thought to ourselves, what are the youth groups thinking about? Those that are going to vote for the first time, where are they going? How are they politicizing? And we began to see who they're following in TikTok, social media, and to them it made a lot of sense. The speeches of Agustin and Milei and Gloria Alvarez. Sorry about this for Guatemalans, and a lot of speeches that made sense of the people that want to get to the mechanisms and media of consumption. We began to see how our old words began to ring a bell in their head, and they began to look at others as elders. And we are now where the right wing sells their speech as something politically incorrect, as being a rebel, which is being against equality. Being a rebel is being against the advances of colleagues in their fundamental rights. What did we do in our historical causes? How did we disconnect from our healthy memory that our causes now are as the imposition or politically incorrect, what they call mavericks. And to be mavericks is to be fascist. So we had to have a counter speech with generations that will not be convinced with old speeches. And we also saw that many of those that were references during the emancipation process, Juan Pablo Casanova passed away in 2023, and they're not willing to keep training us. And we don't want to be the generational relay. We don't have the capacities or ways to fill those shoes, but we must make an effort to translate all those teachings to the keys and codes of new generations that are making questions, not to think like us or by our agenda or to follow our doctrine, but to have access to those key elements that invited us to think in a different way and have their own opinions. So our first experiment, we thought before 2023 was over, We had a pedagogy school, political, online, on Zoom. Saturdays, early morning, we decided to have a Latin American calling, and over 100 people registered. The ones from Brazil left soon because we couldn't interpret Portuguese, but we wanted to get to the TikToker population. There was a 10% of participants that connected. Most of them were millennials from our generation, and we found out we needed more dialogue and working with peers. We had 2 editions of the school, and it's been very successful. We hope to have a third one. If you'd like to register, you are very welcome. We had Rosa Chavez in the first edition. We were very lucky to have her from Guatemala. And then we dared to have, due to the support of Surge Alianza Surge, to go from being virtual to having face-to-face dialogues, impossible dialogue. We had one in Monterrey yesterday. There was one in Villahermosa, Tabasco, because we can have people that were together before and now we're set apart and we can't talk to each other because some support the government and others are against it, and now we can't talk to each other. So in the impossible dialogues we say, let's take off the hood, and if you don't agree with the president, or if you agree, let's talk about what are we going to do with climate change, with the supposed democracy and militarization. So we're in this round of impossible dialogues that vibrate a bit with different dialogues. Perhaps we're not approaching the conflict totally, but we're listening to ourselves and setting the cause in the center, because if we want power, the cause is set aside. The third step we want to give is for dialogues and intergenerational exploration forums accompanied by engineer Cardenas and generations that have fought for democracy many generations ago, and colleagues that are centennials that have politicized due to TikTok a lot. And even though they come from private universities that have been the epicenter of neoliberalism, I think they're communist because they have consumed TikToks from Americans that are communists. So they're discussing Lenin from the US communist point of view. So we tell them it's good that you're being politicized, but perhaps if you talk to the Latin American ancestors, you could talk about the different ideas and with generosity think, how do we hold up the possibility of having a democratic floor where to dream with a Mexico of equality, where you could see memory, truth, and justice show up and rise. So I don't have the recipe to have intergenerational dialogues, but in the fascist spectrum stages, we must leave prejudice aside and open our hearts, be humble to experiences of other generations, to come closer. And there are a lot of systematic complexes from generations of the 20th century that come really well in the 21st century, where they think about 15-second clips and this agility and capacity to have messages that connect quickly, that explode quickly, with generations from the 21st century, but generations from the 20th century. The first day, the colleague from El Salvador said, I will not use TikTok, and I agreed to have someone discuss what's being done in TikToks to generate curiosity and that make it viral, to think what type of democracy is this and how.
Thank you very much, Bosque and Myriam. You know that I'm going to read a quick news update that came out today that I think it has to do quite a lot with what we're sharing right now from the UN. UN human rights adopts, the damage of the transgenerational damage and also forced displacement of Mayan, forced displacement of the Mayan people. And they submit that with a new focus, this committee also deemed that the state has not only violated the rights of those people that were displaced forcefully, but also of children, boys and girls of the third generation born while their communities were still displaced, whom they transmitted the trauma of the painful situation of that displacement. It's a news update, which I believe that has a lot to do with what we're speaking right now. It's a reality for Guatemala. Now those boys and girls today, they were no longer so young, so boys and so girls. But what something I wanted to stress out is that we all have realities. Sometimes sufferings that traverse all generations that continue to mark us, throughout our lifetime. And so I believe that what Bosque just conveyed about sharing, it's very useful, really powerful tools, useful tools to be able to work on all these traumas, that we all need to overcome to continue moving forward, finding paths, with hope and for hope. I'm going to open up this space for Q&A, but first of all, I want to thank you because in reality, I confess that how we chose these presentations. So both were mentioned, but we actually took a deep look, and I believe that we talked about this yesterday, that precisely we needed to close with these subjects and with these inspirational experiences, and also with this drive and force as well, because we didn't want to go back to the same circle when we first started, of catharsis. But here, with them by our side, we wanted to close in this way. So we're going to open this time now for a little bit of Q&A, both for Myriam and Bosque, please. And we can begin. Any questions? Please raise your hand. Thank you so much, to both presentations, to all the presentations throughout the last 3 days. Just a quick question for Myriam, because I thought that it was quite interesting how from Valientes, you present these dialogues with the others, because all too often we're wanting to talk about us with us, and we continue flipping around the same subject, but we never actually engage, other individuals different from us. So I'd like to quickly ask you that if you found any challenges along the way, and what have been those strategies to be able to face those hurdles or challenges to speak with the others who think differently from us with a different type of subject matter in our views. Hello, thank you so much for your presentations. Honestly, I thought that they were extremely hopeful, especially in these dire times where authoritarianism right now, precisely what it does is to weaken or the rupture of our social fabric. Yes? So I'm going to ask a very basic question, but I would just like, if it's not too much trouble, to get to know from your experience and track record, where or which are those necessary conditions to give way for these methodologies of dialogue, to be able to contribute towards the rebuilding of our social fabric, ensuring the security of those who are actually engaging the dialogue, because we know that in these violent contexts, there's also a security piece also that we have to take into account. And so what are the necessary conditions to be able to carry out and employ these methodologies? And I would like to just approach one of you to be able to ask bibliographies concerning, the foundation of all the work that you do, which I believe is absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. My name is Claudia de Fraiman from Chiapas. And I thought it very interesting, both your presentation, especially on the dialogue piece, because of the polarization and that we've been speaking about for 2 days. And I had another question that's quite similar to my peers concerning your methodologies. What precedes these dialogues? Yes, how do you prepare them? How do you set the boundaries or limits, to avoid re-victimization? Yes, and so that everyone who partakes in them, might leave them well, physically, mentally, and to also have something a little bit more in the talache, concerning the methodology. How exactly do you go about preparing these dialogues and exchanges? One more over there. Yes. Okay. Well, I would like to present a challenge there, thanking your presentation here, and asking, how do you believe that a dialogue can be prioritized, as a method of reconciliation to open up doors for the future, if in communities and people impacted by the current political and social policies have kept them in survival mode, when the agenda of many of our communities was practically about survival, about food survival and life survival in many different spheres. Sometimes it would seem as if to cure, heal, and provoke, dialogue proposals are for those who have a full belly and who's doesn't fear for their lives. And another more provoking question, perhaps, how can those impacted by current policies can participate in the design of these methodologies and in the design? Why? Because we're pretty well used to, to see with the best of intentions that the middle class, the white middle class with its privileges, are the ones who design the methodologies with which others need to dialogue around peace. And there are very few spaces in which, from the methodological design itself, women in the communities and peoples are able to design how they would like these dialogues to take place. And more like a sub-piece of I ask this not only because on behalf of rural indigenous communities and everything, but inclusively, Trump voters are sectors that didn't feel part of any of the democratic victories, even in the U.S., and they are seen as nacos or illiterate or rednecks, like they call them over there. See, campesinos, rednecks. Thank you so much for these questions. I think the majority of questions are aimed towards both of you. So if you want, we'll start with you, ma'am. Thank you. I really liked your presentation. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it also. They're very similar questions in nature, to be honest with you, And perhaps I'm going to start with the latter one, concerning on what precedes these dialogues in bold to engage. Valientes is a process that is based on a legacy that commenced, by the General Umsbauer of Human Rights, which are the ones who represents the rights of society. And in the year 2000, I had the opportunity to serve as the General District Attorney for Social Dialogue from 2017 to 2021. And when we reach that department, 1 year later, a change in government administration, one that had promised that it would implement the peace accords, yes? And we saw with great concern, because a country that had signed many peace accords, but that hasn't been able to overcome these cycles of violence. And so we started seeing shared experiences. What can we do? And dialogues are well contained within these Havana Accords between FARC and the government in Colombia. And it also requires for there to be an institutional transformation because the state relates with a transactional nature, not ideological. So then, seeing these compared experiences, we saw countries such as Africa, Europe, and Latin America, and we noticed that when certain worlds come together, social world, the business world, the political world, the institutional world, they can create certain floors, certain foundational agreements. And so what convened us was an agreement from us. I'm married with a Dutch man, and this sounds weird for him, but there's no agreement in Colombia about not killing ourselves, that we are going to kick violence out and weapons in the way that we navigate these differences. So then we started working at this, and this was a summit, a dialogue. We call it the Summit of Social Dialogue. It was a cumbersome situation, just so that you have an idea. The first social explosion that took place, back then, was convened by many different organizations gathered in a national committee of about, we had 98% of organizations participating in it. We had 98% of the country. We had every party with political representation in Congress involved in it also. And we also have institutionality, but they wouldn't copy us. When this process already gathered over 500 leaders, 130 organizations. It was a very interesting process, to say the least, of joining, gathering all these different worlds. And once it was done, our administration in Parliament, which is the transition between the work that does leaving administration with the one coming in, we proposed to the new person who was about to lead this to take it, to run with it. And he said no. They said no. Because our institutions, everyone wants to start from scratch and get recognition, Besides, this wasn't in line with what this new administration wanted to do. And there was something really unexpected that took place, and that the people said, we can't finish this. We can't end this. We cannot allow this process to die. We've got to continue it. And that's where bold to engage, bold to dialogue was birthed. And I say this because many of those gathered there, to set it in Marco's terms, people who live in the greatest fragility, vulnerability, and these were the ones who stayed. There were two sectors who were really interested in engaging, and that was the business sector and the social sector. In the social sector, the enormous diversity was involved. And I believe that this is a sign of hope, of maturity, of our leaders, that we have to go through these processes of exchange, and it's a learning experience. All of the social struggles of the movements that have taken place in Colombia. Concerning the methodology, it's very important. We have documents that we'd be more than glad to share with you. We always say that these are confidential spaces. These aren't clandestine spaces, but confidential spaces. We don't manage networks. We don't take pictures unless they authorize this. There are leaderships that can't be enormously threatened if they're seen right there. There's a picture where they see them seated with someone else. This is not, mind you, an exercise for the limelight, for the spotlight, but to enlighten, to cause reflections, to shift behaviors, but above all, as I said before, and once we say it again, to re-evaluate our own selves. Now, some of the challenges or hurdles are all these, but the one that we've less encountered, is that people really do want to sit down at the table, If someone opens a bridge, providing the security that they'll be respected, that they're not going to finger point, that they're going to be heard, people come down and sit down. Right now we have a driving group that's very diverse. The names are public. You would never imagine that these individuals are actually seated together to exchange a dialogue. Let me end with this. We're not the only exercise of this nature in Colombia. In fact, there are many. And our thesis is that part to make this work, it has to be seen within an ecosystem code. If we do not sit down with others, if we do not work with others, if we do not think on common purposes, if we do not devise a strategy, and if we do not respect our differences, well, this is going to be valuable, yes, but it's not going to be able to eradicate and change those issues in society. And one of our main aspirations is for all these processes to radiate, to glow. And one of the tricks that we use that worked pretty well, now this has to do a lot with the space where we meet together, the lighting. We always want to have places where there's lots of nature. Contact with nature is very important. It generates many more opportunities, amazingly. And we always gather people that were complete opposites, very opposable. The first question they'd always ask me, Myriam, I think that you made a mistake. You sat me down with this other guy. I think these leaders of the FARC, my dad was killed. He was slain by the FARC. I mean, just imagine the burden. I said, no. There was no mistake. And there's some people that have got to sit all day. And he had a little dog at the end of the day, Let me share a quick story because she shared it and it's a public domain now. In this process, the wife of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, former president of Colombia, has participated in this. And in one of these meetings, we also had the brother of Simón Trinidad, former FARC guerrilla, extradited to the U.S. on behalf of Álvaro Uribe, and they sat down to converse in one of these exercises, and she would tell him that she could not believe that her husband had devoted his entire life to find him, to find his brother, to capture him, and then to extradite him. And he would say that he could not believe that his brother, the military objective, primary one, was to slay her husband, to kill her husband. And so then these also are spaces, let's say, of deep opportunity for healing. The dialogue is in therapy for those who like therapy, but it does have therapeutic effects, and the methodology involves helping these actors to be able to engage in this reliable, confidential, safe space where all of these situations can be freely expressed in this safe manner. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful questions. Yes, I see a hand over there. Okay. Yes. Powerful questions. Very quickly, how can we care? What tools of self-care can we use to engage in dialogues? Our dialogues are really humble. Our convenings has been bottles in the sea. We don't know who's going to show up, who's going to be there. But the moment that we arrive, we establish, agreements of coexistence, understanding that if someone has anything sensitive, for them to feel safe, okay? To build a safe space for all of them. In other words, we haven't have to apply, for the emergency psychological kit, but we do assume that we say, we can't put more on the plate than that which we can eat, understand what are the conditions that we're facing, as a minimum tool for privacy. We ask people that for their own safety to not appear mentioned in a memory, or if we post something, to make it known if they don't want to appear in that, to avoid it. And if we have to make an intervention anonymous, we will anonymize it, okay? But these are very small initiatives. We still haven't had to face such sensitive processes along the way. Now, concerning the provocation, how can we engage in dialogue from survival? If we don't engage from that mode of survival, we will never survive. Obviously, we can't engage with empty stomachs. I understand that, yes. But we're not only slain with hunger, but also when they isolate us from the possibility of engaged dialogue, we need to understand that impossible dialogues right now are dialogues that are precarious. These are dialogues, that are vital. At least in the impossible dialogues, that we've organized, we have contemplated, transportation, commuting costs, and the food and the meals for that day to be there. People that come from outside the city. In Tabasco, we had the forest community, which is one of the first climate displaced climate communities, whose lands have already been taken by the sea. And obviously, we cover the cost to ensure that they could be detonative presenters concerning this climate crisis. Now, who's going to make these questions and where we ask these questions? We don't assume that based on the organization, at least from the different organizations and the allies that have helped us organize these dialogues, we provide these questions and we provoke it, but then the community that has gathered to engage, they define the course that we're going to navigate in the questions and the epistemic exploration. Something I like these impossible dialogues in Monterrey is that we lance the session. 8 out of our 10 people that showed up, they were individuals that we did not know, individuals that weren't always the same phases. These are the activists. They weren't the activists that know the process. And they said, okay, great, this resonates. We were able to reach those corners that we hadn't been able to reach before. And something that was wonderful in this impossible dialogue is that one of the conclusions was that we have to continue holding these encounters. We need more safe spaces where we can share our stories. And something crazy that took place is that one of the inequality processes that were named, the closed fractionings against those fractionings that weren't closed. And there was a story about how one of these hindered the canal to go through their fractioning, during a flood and lots of rainwater, provoking a flood in the neighborhood below. And there's a person from the neighborhood below and one in the closed fractioning that were engaging with it and said, okay, hello, we're here. And so inequality is traversing us and we have to shift it, transform it, remove it, or eliminate it. But as I insist, our efforts are still really meager and humble, in nature, and we're moving forward. And thank you so much for all these calls. Obviously, we cannot engage with an empty stomach. You're right. I'm going to adopt, if we do not engage, we will not survive. Yes? Create material conditions for people to show up to these dialogues is really important. Not everyone is going to arrive in the same way, with the same sense. One of the tasks that we have is we have lots of social leaders participating. You know that social leadership is under lots of threats in Colombia. And many of the leaders that engage in dialogue are high impact leaders. So we exercise the greatest care because we do not want to expose them. And something that we've learned is that being in this space helps them as a mechanism of protection, as a protective mechanism. And to such diverse people and ex-military, and people from institutionality realms and politicians and business people, these connections also aid to be able to increase those levels of safeguards. Whenever we invite people to dialogues, for example, social leaders, they never travel at night. They generally don't live like many of us in a city and they just grab a plane and show up, But they live in places where they have to take a chalupa, or they have to travel by mule, and they have to go through guerrilla terrain and illegals that are armed. So then we've also learned to generate the right mechanisms to not place them at risk, But what we've seen is that these networks of connecting with other leaders has also helped them as mechanisms to safeguard and protect them, yes? And we're also very humble, Don't be thinking that, barely been doing this for 5 years. All right, thank you so much, wholeheartedly. A big old thank you to everyone, and we should have closed already, but I think that, okay. Thank you very much. I'm really interested in the School of Political Pedagogy. the School of Political Pedagogy, because I dare to say that those of us gathered here, which is in my case, we come from a traditional school that banned us from speaking to rights, relating it to politics, relating it to religion, and zero sexual education. So then how do we disrupt this? Disrupt these spaces with a school with children or young people? Me particularly, I really like this because I do believe that that is the route that we need to start to build. That's the right path to generate a new leadership that can substitute or take the place of those that will be left behind. Thank you. I want to express my gratitude for this presentation, for sharing your experience. Perhaps I'm not going to ask a question necessarily, but just two quick remarks. The first one is that the why, that at times fears pervade, fear to exchange, to share my truth. It's usually because we've inherited time and time again all of those fears. They're handed down, yes. We never finish healing, a trauma from our childhood, the collective trauma, our family trauma, and trauma too often in our organization, and trauma at our workplace, or at times, the situations of conflict, even amongst our own organizations. So then these are part of the grave limitations. Therefore, I believe that very few times are we able to carry out a work of healing. But this is where we learn that we're never going to be successful unless we heal all of those problems that affect our life, that affect our spirit. And I am completely sure that in these communities there are methodologies, there are natural methodologies, because were it not so, I do not think that we would continue to live today and we would have never learned to resist. It's just like there's been a lot of slogans, resist and resist to survive, or resist and resist to overcome, resist to move forward, to advance. So I believe that all of these processes, be they of healing, perhaps the strongest piece is what war leaves behind, but something that it has also left, the practices of institutional racism that currently exist. And racism sometimes are transferred between social actors. And I treasure and value that we speak on this subject, and that I hope that we can all learn collectively to commit to healing ourselves. Because our experience as survivors of genocide here in Guatemala is that with the few, because here in Guatemala there was around over 60,000 women raped by the armed forces, and in part by the guerrillas. But to a certain degree, working on the healing, it helps women to be much more active, to be purpose-driven, and to dare to fight for all of these rights, yes? So then I believe that it's really important to be aware and conscious, because we know that the state will never do it. They're always going to be questioning us, right? And even society itself, they're never going to understand either. We've seen that at times even international cooperation there is none to be able to carry out healing process, so that we really do need and design our own methodologies. We've been working this healing subject with water, with fire, with exchanges, with music, and also with organizational processes as intergenerational also. So I think that this is an important piece, and also to say that at times, why are we in this society that's so difficult? It's because think of how many militaries who were also taught to kill, to pillage, to rape, to burn. What little people have, many of them stepped in, and since they were forced and obliged to do so, so they were left extremely traumatized. And that's why interfamily violence is so strong in our nations. And the other one is that I believe that we have seen in our case with males, with men who have served in the military and men who have served in guerrillas, they're equally violent altogether. Unfortunately, even though we don't want to accept it as so, it's the reality of our society. Obviously, violence can't be placed in the balance, who more, who less. No! But violence is violence, and therefore traumas are all the same. And now we have never dared to say, to go for the military to go through mental health procedures, because it's not our job. But we are interested as women, we are interested what has taken place with our young ladies, with our pregnant elders, as well as with our leaders and with our mothers. Just that. Sorry, it's out of earshot, can't hear. The first person to ask to be able to say something, I'm sorry, they already gave us 30 minutes more, but just remember that the takeaways after these 2.5 days, we can also take with us questions, and what we're also going to take back to our spaces. We can also take these questions, to continue with this ongoing discussion. We've got to close because of time limitations, and we still have some more time this afternoon to continue exchanging. Yeah, Maria Camilla. Yes. Maria Camilla. Yes. I'm sorry. Maria Camilla. I would like to ask a question regarding to our panelists. My neurourgence, has got me thinking on 1,000 other things, because neurovirgins were a different landscape. So my question is, how can we make these dialogues not become a landscape of impunity? Yes? Because every time that they sit us to engage in dialogue, they become landscapes of impunity. Yes? One of the clearest examples we can see is the subject of police repression. The moment that we sit down to the police to engage into dialogue, the scene of reparations for victims is ended. The dialogue ends right there, because both NGOs, such as state organizations, are in the search for dialogue, but not in reparations. So that in this regard, these peace processes, improbable, impossible dialogues are turning in our communities to landscapes of impunity. Because that's not to me that just to sit down with those who were violent against me, because it's a concept that's supremely Catholic, of sit down and speak. And I mentioned yesterday at a table to sit down and speak, I speak, and they continue, being violent against me, and I turn the other cheek, and this is all part of democracies. And so it's when speaking is also going to have included uncomfortable conversations, obviously in a respectful manner, but also highlighting the realities that are actually taking place. For example, in Colombia, improbable dialogues have generated impunity, like in the peace process. Yes. How would you manage this within this landscape? I think that it's a valid reflection, a valid question. On behalf of Camilla, thank you. First of all, I would differentiate dialogues from negotiation. Agreements between the government and FARC, that's a negotiation with a set goal of removing the weapons from a guerrilla group, and to exert a series of transformations that are seen as structural and that gave way to this conflict of violence. The dialogues that we propose aren't institutional dialogues. In fact, we don't have anyone exercising any institutional office, because otherwise that's precisely what happens. We have ex-ministers, ex-directors, former generals, former directors, people that have gone through public life. We have former ministers, not people who actively have a role within the public apparatus to have to respond right now. And what we do is to facilitate comprehension. It's not to convince, but it's to go and understand how a reality is lived by multiple actors in different ways. The policeman, the military official exercising their roles, or, for example, carrying out activities, for the contention of illegal crops, right? Illegal usage of crops. They get into a chopper. The peasant that is out there on their land, living impoverishedly. There are different realities. These worlds will never naturally come together. And when they do, it's usually within the framework of reivindications. Fine, fantastic, Dialogues do not want to supplement or remove those spaces. Spaces of reivindication are necessary. But there's no space to be able to understand complex problems from different dimensions. And this is precisely what processes such as Valiente provides, living processes and adaptive in nature. All right, really quick. Nana, Rosalina, thank you. Man, your words heal, ma'am. Your words are healing. And Camille, I think we have to learn a lot from our elder brothers and sisters. If dialogue will not heal us, let's not sit down. We'll never sit down to dialogue. But if we really want to keep with that, bitterness, then we're never going to heal. We've got to learn from these methodologies in our ancestral communities to build minimum conditions, to sit down and to make it healing and not re-victimize, because you're absolutely right. You're absolutely true. If we sit someone at the table, if we're re-victimizing, you're deepening violence, and it's going to be pointless if you don't. But if we don't give an opportunity to heal, then it's fascism all over again. So it's a challenge. How do we process our violence, and forgiveness can only come from victims, that's the main rule, Buddy, just really quick, we've improvised this and we try to find presenters that can present a subject, share on a subject, and it's been coming out. But I believe that a challenge, for our next step is to let's build an entire curriculum of minimum elements, for training that's not doctrinal nature. We don't need catechists nor militants, but we need people with tools to be able to address contemporary questions with learnings and knowings of much experience. Let's build it together, let's put this school together. What do you think, huh? Yeah, let's do it. All right, we're way over time. I want to thank you wholeheartedly, to both of you too, and for everyone for your attention. Let's leave a song that Myriam shared over here. We're going to launch this afternoon with her to make sure that we do not nullify her and not to draw back. And we're going to share it. Okay, big round of applause for this wonderful panel and for all of you as well. Thank you very much. Great job. Wonderful job.